Hey everyone, it's Charlene. Today I'm going to show you how I made this beautiful card, and I'm going to be sharing with you how to ink smoosh without getting a mucky, kind of muddy mess with your colors. I'm starting out here with the Tim Holtz Travel Media Surface Mat. Bit of a mouthful, but this is a really nice mat for any kind of mixed media, especially ink smooshing. Now this mat is actually meant to go with the travel size glass mat, but I use just this mat and I add it to my regular work surface that I have. Now the reason this mat works really well is because when you get your distress inks or your distress oxides wet, the ink is going to bead up on the mat. If you add the inks to a slick surface like a glass mat, they're going to mix and combine together. So I've started out with some distress oxides. I have picked raspberry and Kitsch Flamingo, and then I'm dotting in some carved pumpkin, a nice little pop of orange. And that orange is a pretty strong color, and I just want a little bit, so I'm just dotting it in here and there. Now you can swipe your ink pads like I'm doing, or you can smoosh them onto the surface, whatever works well. Once you have your inks down, you're going to want to spritz them with some water. I'm using the distress sprayer you see up in the top right hand corner. And then you're going to want to use a piece of watercolor paper. You can do this with regular cardstock, but I absolutely recommend using watercolor paper because you're going to get a much better outcome with the watercolor paper. Watercolor paper is meant for water. It is meant to get wet over and over again, and the colors are just going to show up much better and look much nicer on a piece of watercolor paper. The other thing that can ensure a really nice result is drying your paper in between layers of ink. Now you don't have to fully dry the paper, you just want to get it dry enough that when you add your next layer, it's not going to all just turn into that mucky mess. The other thing to consider is the colors that you are putting onto your paper. So if you are trying to use two complementary colors like a red and a green, or a yellow and a purple, those are going to turn brown when you mix those two colors together. So try to stick with colors that are close to each other on the color wheel. So here I'm using pinks and oranges. Those are going to blend very well together. And all I do is I just keep going back in and smooshing my paper onto the color that is on my work surface and drying in between each layer. So you can see here now it's kind of picking up those little dots that are left, so it's giving some variation on the paper. Once I've used up all the ink that I have on my mat, I'm going to go ahead and wipe off the excess that I have there. And I'm going to come back in and I'm going to use some distress inks. I like to smoosh with both distress oxides and distress inks. And the reason is because distress inks, when they are wet, they stay true to color. Whereas when you're working with distress oxides, once they get wet, they're going to get this really nice pastel color. And so if you're using the same color, here I'm going to be using some picked raspberry in the distress ink, and I'm also going to use the Kitsch Flamingo in the distress ink. And those are going to be more vibrant than the distress oxide version. I've also brought in here some spun sugar, and that's because I really want to get pink overall. And I am going to dab in a little bit more of that carved pumpkin distress oxide just here and there because I want a few more pops of orange. Now again, misting with my water, you can see how it's beading up there on the surface. And you can either lay your entire panel down like I'm doing, or you can do that kind of partial smooshing technique where you just dab different parts of the paper into the colors. Now keep in mind when you are doing this, you do need to give that paper a little bit of time to suck up that color. So if you are just dabbing it really quick, that color is not going to lift very well onto your watercolor paper. And again here, I am drawing in between the color layers, and I'm going to go back in and dab here and there to get some more of that dot pattern. So by doing this in layers, when we get finished, I'm going to have lots of overall color, but I'm also going to have that fun variation with the flecks and dots on the paper. A couple of things to keep in mind: you may be going for that blended look. You can definitely accomplish that by starting with your paper being misted with water, because then once it touches the ink that is on your work surface, it's going to start moving around and blending quite a bit. And once you're done here, if you want the inks to blend a little bit at that point, you can spritz your entire paper with water, which is what you saw me do here. I just spritzed the whole surface, and I'm coming back in and drying it once again. The other thing to consider is that you can ink blend over this once everything is dry. So if there are any areas where you really want to bring out more of the color, or you want to fill in a white space, if you're not wanting to have white space, you absolutely can go in with your blending brushes and just add a bit of ink exactly where you are wanting it to go. So I added a few more layers of color until I was happy with how everything was. And now I have this beautiful pink and orange paper. Now this is probably not something I personally would use for a background, but I chose this color combination because I knew I was going to be die cutting this sheet to create florals. So I did make sure that my paper was completely dry before I moved on to die cutting out all of the floral pieces. To create those, I'm using the Bold Backgrounds Vintage Roses. This is a beautiful die set, and I'm going to cut out all of the florals that I'm going to need. For this set, it's 2 of the large florals, 3 medium, and 2 small. To add some more dimension to my florals, I'm coming in here with my number 1 Waffle Flower shader brush, and I'm using more of that picked raspberry distress ink, and I'm just very lightly going around the edges of each piece of the floral. And sometimes I will pull that ink up a little bit higher if I know I want to add a little bit more drama, a little more of that bright pop of pink. And I know there's a lot of pink going on here, but trust me, when all is said and done, it's going to look fabulous with the background. I repeated the same process with all of the die cuts, and then I moved on to my background. Here I have some Distress Oxide in Mermaid Lagoon, and I use this because I wanted a very specific blue for my background, and I actually could not find a piece of cardstock in my stash that was the color blue I was envisioning. So I decided to make my own, and I think it turned out fabulous because I was able to add even more texture to the background. So I'm using a large brush here from Honeybee, and I'm just applying that ink all over an A2 size card panel. I'm not really concerned about blending and making sure I get a perfect result here, because I'm going to come in with my distress sprayer and I'm going to add some texture to this background. Now, if you've never worked with distress inks or distress oxides, they are water reactive and they have some really interesting properties to them that allow the ink colors to wick. So what that means is when you add water to them, the water pushes the ink away from itself, so you get these really defined and beautiful spots on your paper when you do any kind of spritzing with water. Now I've come in and spritzed my background here. I let it dry and you can see all of those beautiful formations that have been created. Now with the distress ink, again, it stays true to color, and in just the areas where the ink has kind of gathered, you'll get a little bit more of a bold version. Whereas with the distress oxide, if you do any kind of spritzing on there, the spots where the water hits, it's going to turn that nice white pastel-y kind of color. So moving on to the rest of my background, I'm going to take the large plate from the Vintage Roses set and I'm going to cut that out of white cardstock. So I'm going to get this background piece that has all of the leaves, and I'm actually going to cut this whole piece down with a rectangle die. I'm coming in with the third from largest die, and that'll give me a nice white border when all is said and done. I'm going to set that aside and I'm going to start on putting my florals together here. So I'm just adding glue to the center part of each layer of the floral. I'm not adding it to the petals. And the reason I'm not adding it to the petals is because when I'm done, that will allow me to fold up the petals to make the flower three-dimensional. So once I have all of the layers of the floral down, I'm going to go ahead and take the small die that cuts out the centers for the flowers, and I'm going to cut that out of some white cardstock, and I'm going to color it with some Copic markers. I'm using Y15, and that's going to give me that yellow center. And then I'm actually going to go around the edge with Y38, which is more of an orange color. And so that's going to give that center part a little bit more depth. Now I hung on to the very last petal, and that's because I want to pop this up with some foam tape. So I'm just using a little foam square. I've cut it in half, and that is going to elevate that last petal up above the center of the floral. So that's going to again give it that three-dimensional look, make it look more like a real floral. For the three small buds, I'm using the piece that cuts out the base of the bud. Now normally this would be green, but I've cut it out in white cardstock because it's going to coordinate with the white leaves that we've cut out in the main plate. So I'm going ahead and I'm gluing the white piece to that blue background that we created. And then I'm going to glue all of my florals where they are supposed to go. It's really easy to see where they are supposed to go because there is no embossed details on the floral parts of the white piece. It's only on the leaves. So all you need to do is glue each of the florals, and it's pretty simple to figure out where they're supposed to go. So I've glued the two large florals, and now I'm going to glue the three medium-sized florals, and then I'm going to go ahead and pop up each of the three buds using some foam squares. So I'm going to place the foam squares onto my card panel here, and then I can pop the bud right over the top of that foam square. If you have any excess, just trim it off with a pair of scissors. Now I'm going to add some Picket Fence Distress Oxide spray to the whole background. This is going to add some really nice white dots and splatter onto the background and just tie everything all together. I love using this to add that extra final little touch to cards. Once dry, I can glue the entire piece to my card base, and then off camera I did stamp and die cut my sentiment. I used the Eternal Love 6x6 stamp set, and I cut out a couple extra of the sentiment die cuts and layered them up just to give it a little bit more dimension. So here is the finished card. I hope you guys picked up some tips and tricks today. Please be sure to like and subscribe, as well as hit that notification bell so that I can continue bringing you more crafty content in the future. Until next time, happy crafting.